I always make it known to my team that I'm not one to watch them or micromanage them. I give them a lot of space, and sort of give them the freedom to do what they want. And I think one of my biggest keys is that there was a large bonus out there for the company. And the date that was set, everyone thought that was unachievable. And, I guess me being me, sure, no worries, we'll get there, And look, we got there and we got the full bonus. Everybody said, how'd you do that? It's like when you get to site, you always go out in the morning, you kind of go out at lunch, you go out at the end of the day, so you understand what's being done. Whereas now, I think that's lost. A lot of the people coming through the system now are just almost.
Let's start out with I want to know, and I always ask this question because it fascinates me. How did you end up in the career that you're in now? Where did it come from for you?
And I guess I'll start. It's a long story short, but
Yeah, yeah, let's do it.
I never really wanted to be an engineer, and I guess I have to thank my mother and my sister for that. I always wanted to be a mechanic, and I was told, "Hey, that's only a hobby," and what a hobby it is. But yeah, look, I was happy to drop out in year 10 and I was forced to go to year 12. And when I got to the end, it was, yeah, look, I probably wanted to be a vet first, but let's face it, I kind of wasn't smart enough to be a vet. So I had to become an engineer.
Okay. So why did you want to be a vet? What was that? Did you just loved animals or just interested in science?
Ah, I think it's more the love of animals, I guess. It's probably my
Mm,
preference.
yeah,
And
okay.
yeah, I think I actually did sit the test and it wasn't favorable, but so yeah, I'd take my second choice and I
Okay.
had the marks to be an engineer.
And then tell me about your journey into studying and then also starting your own business.
Studying was probably the tough part. Um, I think I may have clocked up 6 months of full time uni before I thought it was a bit too much for me. And then I guess I went to part time uni and almost a full time job. So I started with a small demolition company. I lasted there maybe 3 to 4 years. And, in that time, I kind of saw how the business worked, how it didn't. I quickly became a project manager running the majority of sort of the business works. I'm like, yeah, you know what? I could probably do this. And I think what really happened, and I still think this is a big thing in your career, is that no one really, um, I guess, gives you a pat on the back when you do something well. It's always when everything's going well, you don't hear, but when something goes wrong, it's always you sort of get kicked down. Oh, that was wrong. This was wrong, but you never ever. And I make a point of, even with the people I manage, to say, yeah, look, that's a really good job. You're doing really well. So it's just a bit of positive feedback. And I think that's was a defining moment when you're doing so much and you can see what you're doing and you're never getting the thanks for it. So it's kind of like, yeah, you know what? It's not that hard. I can do it myself. And I kind of started while I was still working. And it sort of came to a head, and the business owner said to me, it's either you get rid of what you're doing and stay here, or you leave. I said, thanks very much. You made my decision. And yeah, I kind of never looked back from there.
Okay. So you've got into this role, you haven't felt appreciated. I want to go back as well when you talked a little bit around your marks and things like that, and that influenced your decision because you're very much what I would describe as an entrepreneurial type person, right? That's your personality through and through, and we'll explore more on that later. What's that like, in school? What's it like when you think like that and you're trying to work in our current education system?
Very difficult. Um, yeah, school was always an effort for me. Um, yeah, I had multiple jobs while at school. And then I guess up until year 11 when my sister said, hey, look, you've really got to knuckle down and sort of do it. And I did. But yeah, look, I wouldn't say I was the best of students, probably a troubled student. I always remember, chemistry on veranda or, not being in my commerce class and things like that. It was just really difficult.
What was it about school that you found a challenge as a young boy?
Um, it's a very difficult question, but I would say it was more so, which is always apparent, like even with my son at the moment. You actually, whatever you're learning there is. not relevant to the outside world, I guess. Yeah. And I think that's the message you take away and sort of being there and, being where I am now. And, the message I give to the kids is that you're only learning how to learn and where to find the information. So, yeah, if that's what you take away from school, it becomes a very important part of your later career where you go and inform yourself on ideas and things like that. Same through uni. You're not really you're given this information and you finish uni and go, "Wow, that was a waste." Nothing I've used in my uni is really relevant to today, but the understanding that you learn sometimes in some of the subjects you do gives you an understanding in what you do in your career today, but it gives you the grounding to be able to find what you want successfully and sort of navigate the better options of what you find out
Mm.
there.
So then fast forward, so you leave that company and you decide that you're going to start your own business. Is that the moment after finished with that demolition company
Yeah.
while you're studying?
Correct. I think I still had another 2 years left of my degree
How?
to go.
How did you do that?
Look, I don't know. Some people say um, that it's kind of maybe a talent. It's probably my downside that I didn't study. I probably didn't go to uni as much as I should have. One of the things was I drive around because I was obviously going to uni and I wouldn't find a parking spot and just go home. I think it was back then it was really different because, these days everything's online, so it would have been so much easier. Whereas, back when I finished or went to uni, everything was face to face. I think it was almost 6 hours per subject, and some part-time loads I was doing 3 subjects, maybe 4 sometimes where that was a full-time load. But I think I just navigated around it and, there were times where, I'd have to argue with the uni to let me do the subjects because they wouldn't let me do them,
Mm.
just in order to be able to finish. It wasn't easy, but I sort of got through there. And look, I think the way I am, I say it to everybody, P's mean degrees. Like, if I got a honours or a high distinction, I don't think it would have made me any better. I think, like said to you before, I think it comes from the real world experience that you have through your career, where you started, even to the point where before I started uni, I was a labourer for a long time. So I think these things just, cement what you do later on and the career path you choose.
And what are the values? So you talk about the other experiences that you had. What was being shaped, do you think, when you were a labourer and when you had your own business that you still take through with you today around your work ethic and, how you do your role?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, and I kind of say that um, the work ethic, it's always a hard work ethic, and still today, I still work hard no matter what I do. If it's at work, I'm harder in the garden or something like that, or, building something at home. It's always 110%. But I think the biggest thing to take away, and I was sort of thinking about it, is that um, I guess potentially the way I've been brought up, but, I think it was more driven through having your own business is that every dollar is your dollar. Yeah. And today I still take it to the point where every dollar is my dollar. And I've sort of had that the whole way through my career is, where you spend a dollar, is that a dollar's worth of value? Is it $10 worth of value or is it 50 cents? And you're trying to, and I think that's the point I make to a lot of people that I mentor these days is that, um, would you accept that if you pay for it at home? So if you had somebody come out and, paint your architrave or something, and they used, a watered down paint. Would you accept that when you pay $10 for it when it's only worth 5? And the answer is generally no. And I say, well, it's the same out on site. If the curb's cracked or the tree looks dead, don't accept it. It's treat it as your money.
Mm. And when you start to do that, so you move into having your own business, what I'm curious about is there you're kind of building that foundation. You've got that work ethic. It's that ownership piece, which we've spoken about before, and taking ownership for what you do, the money you spend, your budgets, your profit on projects and things like that. You built that ownership early on. Then you go into working for other companies with other engineers. What was that like?
Um, yeah, look, and I've said it before. I think that was I guess the journey that started where, I'd been out of uni, had my own business and then, I was sort of kicked into and said, well, you don't know anything, you got to start like at a graduate program again. So look, I did that and sort of grinned and bear it. And obviously I didn't last long enough because of what I've been doing. But it's kind of I wouldn't say it was a bad thing that I did take a few steps back to go forward. Look, potentially it shaped the career that I have at the moment. So at the way I think, it was actually, a good to take that point to step back and then move forward.
Mm.
And answering your question, it became, look, I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing. So when I started working, everybody had a different mindset to what they do now, where, you're more, you look after the dollars a little bit more, you sort of treat it more as your own. Or I've just been lucky and had a few projects where, they're a good team, where they all got on well together and, had that same sort of mentality where, we try and do a great job, try to do it for the best value that we can get.
What are some of the ways that you've got kids, you talk about ownership and hard work, but what does that translate and mean when you're on a project? Or how do you check yourself to make sure that you've got that mindset? What are the things that you look at and question yourself on?
Um, it's a good question. Um, I always say to people, and I think like I say, it's a work ethic thing. And, through the projects I've been on, you try to build high performance teams and you sort of say to everybody, there's about 50 or 60% of the time in the project, which is effectively the first 60%, which is the hardest.
Mm,
And if you really, really go hard, you'll set yourself up to a point where, you can cruise in the back end of it till you get to sort of where it's completion and it's, all hands on deck. But it's just a matter of, you know, I guess putting the time aside to make sure you're doing 110% up front to be able to, breeze through the back of it and then relax, because you can't always work at 110%, you just burn out. There's times where, look, I wouldn't lie, things like that have not potentially happened, but you sort of, you get on with it, you try to get over it.
mm. Okay, I need to know this question, and I'm interested in it personally too. If you are 110% person, how do you learn when to stop, or how do you learn your limits?
You probably don't, and that's one of my problems. I just keep going, and that's what it comes down to. Everybody sort of says to me, look, you really got to slow down, or you got to know where it is. But maybe it's a point where I can't sit still, so you just got to you know, keep yourself focused and doing things. And it's like, why do something half-hearted, and then it's going to be difficult, but where you give it enough attention, it'll always make it easier. And this is what I try to say to a lot of people. The more attention you give it, the easier it becomes in the end. It's kind of like the old saying where, all the money's made before you break the ground. Because after you break ground, it's too hard to win it back. It's kind of that mentality, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So you've gone through, and obviously you've had a career in the contracting side, moved into management. How was it, you've got that 110% work ethic, and then you have to lead other people and ensure that they've got the right work ethic and ownership. What was that like? What was that journey like becoming a leader?
It's always a little bit difficult to make that transition from, being, I guess, a worker to a leader. And I guess if you call it mantra is, lead by example. So, I'll always work hard, and then the team around you tends to work hard. And I always say it, and, I always make it known to my team that, you know, I'm not one to watch them or micromanage them. I give them a lot of space, and sort of give them the freedom to do what they want. And I think one of my biggest keys is that, it's the one mistake. And always make one mistake, but never the same mistake twice. And I know you're not learning. And if you make that mistake, look, I'll do anything that I can to, come back from that mistake because, you've got to learn. And the only way you learn is by making mistakes. If you don't make a mistake, how do you really learn? That's when you really learn. And by that mistake, you understand how you need to navigate around that to succeed from that mistake. So then, like I said, I give people that I lead a lot of their own time to do what they want. I sort of say to them, like, I don't want you there from, 7 till 7. You know what you need to do to be ahead. I said, look, if you want to leave it, 2 or 3 today, that's fine. And I guess one of the things that I used to make a point on at site was, If the site leaves at 3, I'm happy to leave at 3, but just be sure that all your work's up to date, because then if it's not, you know, I'll get upset with you, and, you just have to work harder. And you find that, they'll leave at 3 and they work hard the next day, or, generally they'll stay till 5 or 6 because, they can see. But it's not that, like I said to you before, it's about showing recognition where it's valued. And I think one of the projects that, kind of cemented this for me was when I did a project with Fulton Hogan. It was the ramp into the Patrick's terminal. That was, a high performing team. There was a date that was set. And look, to be honest, the date, there was a large bonus out there for the company. And the date that was set, everyone thought that was unachievable. And, I guess me being me, sure, no worries, we'll get there, And look, we got there and we got the full bonus. Everybody said, how'd you do that? It's like, well, we just worked hard, because there was a goal. And I think that's the biggest thing. You need to set the right goals. Without a goal, there's kind of no purpose, and at the project with a goal like that, like, hey, look, we can get the money, the company, look, it was a large bonus, but it got the follow on work from that. So it effectively became, more and more work in the terminal.
And the more you talk about it, the more I realize, that ownership is such a massive asset for a leader in a construction project because, leading up to that project, you've looked at every dollar's my dollar. So you're thinking like a business owner or a business leader leading a project and going, I want to make sure that the company gets that bonus because it then secures that future work as well. So it's a business mindset. It's not just focusing on the technical.
Correct.
So that's one of the things that I've always liked about you is that you have that ability to have that business mindset. You're never just doing your job. You've always got a million things on the go. So talk us through as well other things that you've done personally. I know you've got a board role as well that you've been acting in. So tell me about how you maintain that business mindset outside of work too.
Um, yeah, look, I think it's difficult. And like I sort of said, you've got it from when I guess from having my own business is kind of when it started. And then you kind of move down the track. And I sort of always say to people, when you're looking at a project, the project's like your own business anyway. So being sort of the project manager of that project, you're basically running your own P&L. So it is your business effectively. And that's kind of the way, going forward, you run a lot of the things that, well, yeah, it's a project, it's its own P&L. And then how do you make this succeed? So you watch your dollars, you understand where it's all going, and I think that's the key, and understanding. I think the key to it is understanding where the project's at, it's the earned value of it, where it's sitting, 'cause some of these larger projects, it's quite easy to go, yeah, look, we're making a lot of money, but, the earned value isn't there because you're behind target or your program's behind. And I think that's where you kind of fall in some troubles, and you've always got to be reassessing each step of the job, where it's at and how
Mm.
it's going. That's kind of the easiest way. But look, a lot of it's true, all of your own research, knowing what's going on, trying to be at the forefront of
Mm.
things. Don't just sort of sit there and, I guess, be the sheep, I guess. I think maybe that's how you put it. You've always got to look around the corner, and I think, especially in our industry, knowing what's around the corner is important, and I think when you take a few steps back, through my career, I've always done sort of, different projects, and I wouldn't say it was because, well, I wouldn't say different projects, but, I sort of, after my business, I had very short stints through a lot of through companies. And a lot of people ask me why. And I say, well, it's not that I didn't like it. It was more that I moved to a project that I wanted to do. And that's kind of where that comes from. And knowing around the corner, and I think in this day and age where, everybody's been kind of lucky where, you've worked close to home. But I think now it's becoming more remote projects where, all these people have been spoiled, living, an hour from work. Now that you've got to travel, 3 weeks on, 1 week off or something like that, So, and that's why sometimes you need to understand what's around the corner so you can buck the trend and say, well, okay, there's a project close to where I live. I want to try to get on it. So then you sort of go, okay, I need to, put my name in for that one instead of just sort of waiting till the end and go, oh, there's nothing left. I've got to go
Mm.
remote.
Well, you also did go, so you were at Majura, and so you did travel
Yeah,
as well.
with you.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have an interview room. Still remember that. The
No,
reception chair in the middle of the it's
yeah,
bloody cold in Canberra too.
correct.
Far out.
Yeah, that's
So
exactly right.
you I guess and tell me about the board role too, because I wanna learn more about that because now that's another place where you're able to use your business mindset. So tell us about this pet food and how you get involved in that.
Yeah, look, that was just, I guess, a fluke. I sort of know the
Yep.
two people behind it, and yeah, I think they just wanted a hand, and then sort of a bit out of my scope, but sort of went for yeah, look, I'm happy to be on the in an advisory role, and I think through that, I assisted them setting up their, I guess if you want to call it, a manufacturing process and stuff like that. And again, I'm not a process engineer or anything like that, so it's just a lot of background research. I wrote a couple of manuals for them to be able to implement it. And it
Yeah,
seems to work.
okay.
So it's slowly
Well, that's
growing
your vet,
organically.
dream coming through full circle. You didn't get to be a vet, but you got to do the help out with
No,
the dog food and pet products, so there you
yes.
go. So, talk me through now. Now you're on client side. So now you've had all this experience and now you're working for a developer in a leadership role. How's that shaped your view now too? Because now you're managing a lot of those contractors.
Yeah, look, it's a hard transition. I'm not going to lie. You sort of go from 110%, to working at, anywhere between 68% capacity. There's always more because, you're not actually there in the detail as much. Um, it's interesting. You sort of, I think in the development space, things take a long time. So whereas, I think that's why you sort of, I say it's 80%, but it's not really 80% because when you're, on a project, it's live. Even if you're going through, say, a D&C project, everything's full on. You're trying to get there. Whereas in the development space, you kind of get there and then you're waiting on authority approval, because you're waiting for councils, departments, and everything like that. And I think that's where the time takes. And if you say, yeah, look, we should get it in 3 months, sometimes it takes six. So then you're in that a little bit of limbo, and then it's like, yeah, we're about to get it, and you kind of don't get it, and then you sort of work yourself up, and then you fall back down again because you're like, all right, we're going to go, and then it's like, no, we're not going yet. That's probably the
Mm,
biggest hurdle going from client side, for contracting where you're kind of always on to a client side where you're a developer, delivering projects that, are waiting for approvals, rezonings and things like that. But in saying that, yeah, I feel it's a good thing being in the position I am because yeah, you can actually call out the contractors for what they're doing wrong. So I think traditionally where, developers are just developers, they'd rely on the contractor to do the right thing for them or go the right way. But not even that. I think now I'm getting more involved in the upfront design and things like that, you know, which assists the outcome of
mm,
the project. But yeah, like I think that you've got more, you make the contractor more responsible for what they're delivering. And I guess, look, if you can say you kind of call out the
mm,
bullshit sometimes because, they kind of think, traditionally a developer will say something that sort of gets over the line. Whereas now you kind of question it from, look, an engineering point of view or, a quality point of view. And I think that's one of the biggest things. Like through my career, a lot of it's been, transport, rail and dams and things like that. So you build this appreciation for quality of work, what things need to look like, the standards that need to be in place, whereas some of these, I guess, contractors, haven't got that skill set, don't do those type of work. So they're just like, yeah, look, it'll be all right. Um, it's the old argument that I've sort of told you before. Is it the key or is it the Mercedes project manager type
mm.
thing? There's a bit of a difference between who the project manager is and what projects they do, it's sort of the skill set. I think you find that through different industries as well, where some of them aren't as good as some. And you always see it. All the better project managers, project directors, are always on government projects because it's warranted. Whereas when you're a smaller civil company, you can't afford them. And, look, I'm not saying they're not trying hard, but they just don't understand, I guess, the processes that we come from where you've got, a full quality system, transport especially, and TMR, they're very particular in what you do. So I think that kind of sets it aside because, and again, this is where I come back to where I've sort of said to some of the engineers from the contractors, like, would you accept that at home? Like, if that was your driveway and you paid for it, would you accept it? And they're like, well, it's not my driveway. I'm like, yeah, but I don't care if it's not. But imagine that piece of road was your driveway. Would you accept that as your driveway if you paid, you know, 40,000 for it? And they kind of, and ah, and like, well, that's the answer.
Mm. One of the things you touched on there that I think is really interesting is that commitment to excellence, and one of the things that I wonder how you handle this because I struggle with it. When you've got a high standard for yourself, when you become a leader, I feel like the really challenging thing is you then have that high standard for other people, and even in your sector, you'll have that high standard for the work you deliver. Now, if you're working alongside other people that or have people working for you that don't have that high standard, it can be somewhat frustrating, right?
Frustrating.
So, how do you
Yeah.
learn to pick and manage the non-performers early? Let's just call it out because that's part of the job too. We don't always get all these, fantastic driven, 110% people working with us.
Yeah. Look, it is difficult. Um, and if I said I haven't had my challenges, I'd be lying. And you do. And I think, one of my biggest, I guess, look, I mentor a lot of people. I sort of take the time and work with them. So, look, I may say that, I'm always on, I'm always 110%, but, I understand too, because, when I take it right back to the beginning of my career, you could say, I was 21 on site, almost like a project manager, and I was always fighting for myself because people look at me and go, what would you know? You're only a young kid, so you always had to make the point to be knowledgeable, know as much as you could about anything. So then you sounded right, so it was very difficult in the early stages of my career. And, I think that has cemented for me that, with these people coming through, like even people you work with, you just got to take the time and show them because, if they haven't been shown correctly, you know, they don't know any different. It's like an apprentice. If an apprentice starts off with, a plumber and the plumber's doing it wrong, the apprentice learns that and they think
Mm.
that's the right way. So if they've ever been shown the right way, you sort of can't have it against them. And you've just got to take the time to say, look, yeah, you're doing it well, but here's a better way to do it. And look, a lot of that key of, working hard and, understanding it's, and what I say to a lot of engineers today is, when you go to an organization, you always bring your own things. Yeah, look, it's not in their system, but it's in the background. So over the, I guess 20 odd years now, it's making me sound old that I've been in the industry. I've started building up all my own documentation where you build stuff, and it evolves and it keeps evolving till you get to a point where everything becomes a lot easier. Because instead of reinventing the wheel or you go into an organization and go, yeah, look, that's great. I've got to figure out how to use it. You've got your own sort of document style that you can use and then trans- transfer it back into the organization
Mm.
standard, and it just makes life a lot easier because you've got it all. Like you don't have to go back, look for this or that. You just know where it is. And, the key is you save it per project, or, projects you do because and a lot of the time, people ring me, it's like, oh, do you remember this? I'm like, yeah, hang on, where was it? And they sort of, oh, that's the project. So I go back to that project file. Yeah, I've got it. This is what we did. This is how we did it. So I think it's about becoming, filing your stuff correctly, having a system, knowing where it is.
Okay, now I'm fascinated by this because I've just realized, do you have a system for all the projects you've done where you file them and keep the data? Like, so that's
Pretty
amazing.
much.
Like, what kind of stuff do
Yeah.
you keep a record of? Is it so if you have to build another incrementally launched bridge, you remember how you did it, or what kind of stuff do you? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Stuff like that, stuff where, even for my own business, I've got stuff where you submitted quotes or variations or put tenders in, things like where you kind of built systems to, monitor costs. And then as time's gone, it's morphed and people ask you for it. It's like, yeah, here you go. Or, simple like, yeah, as simple as an Excel program that, you put the dates in and it populates it. So things like that. And people say, "Have you got one?" It's like, "Yeah, I've got one." You sort of give it to them. But like I said, yeah, if you structure it right, and yeah, as you go through your career and the things you use and make, it just makes your life easier because I said, you go back and it's like, oh, you know, incremental loss. Yeah, I did that on the Bridge to Bay Alliance. Okay, I understand. Let's have a look how it worked. Or, you just got some things. You might have a method statement or, things like that came that you did, or, a contractor you worked with and things like
It's
that
a massive one.
that
One
you always
we
go back to.
see, like when we're recruiting the leadership space, one of the things, if a company's going from a 500 million to a billion, or there's a massive growth, the thing that they ask for a lot of the time in their ops managers or their leadership roles is, we need someone who has a good, robust understanding of systems and how to implement that. So it's a repeatable process
Correct.
for our PMs,
Yeah.
our construction managers, to make money on jobs. And it's a common thing that, I guess, that the fortunate thing you had is because you learn in your own business that you need systems, because it's got to be repeatable.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to just keep having the same trip ups and mistakes again and again.
Yeah. But it's a simple thing. Like even when I went to the Cyprus group, and that was kind of that scenario where, you know, they were missing some of the systems. So, one of the simple things I learned, I've been a commercial manager, a contract manager in previous lives, but, it was all about having a contract cheat sheet. And when I sort of got there, it's like, what do you mean? It's like, just the main items when you need to invoice, the dates, the rates, any LDs or things like that, just on a one pager. So, instead of trying to read the contract, and I sort of say to people like, yeah, every contract's the same. There's only like maybe 5 or 6 pages that change a little bit, and you just need to know what they are. You just put on one page, you have that little cheat sheet with you,
Mm.
and it's fine. And same thing, it was about implementing, the budgets, ensuring that the money was there, setting it up, understanding where, the budget was to where it is or what you had to do to change to get other places.
Were you really organized with your POs and all that sort of stuff as well? Were you? Yeah, yes. Yep.
You have to be. You have to be. And I said, in Madura, back in the day, I used to do a lot of startup projects. They used to send me into the horsepower up front to get them sort of set up. So you had to do things right. And I think talking to a lot of people, I think that was kind of, the old Abbey mentality where you had a core bunch of people that used to start the project and set it up correctly. And then they could, start employing people underneath. And then obviously everybody at the top was living and breathing it. So it made it easier to come down through
Mm.
the staff.
So the other thing I want to ask you about, now you're the client, and I think this is just interesting for people to get a perspective. When you're looking at contractors' work, when you're looking at, the quality that comes through, what are the patterns you're seeing? So you've mentioned it's all stems from a good PM. What about their systems and processes? Do you get it? Do you get a sense of that when you're the client reviewing what they're doing?
Yeah, you kind of do, but I think it's taken a few steps back. I think the industry's really changed. So where, we came through the industry, there was a lot of self-performing. So you'd obviously have, you know, you wouldn't have your own labor, but a lot of it be labor hire, or you get a formwork on a square meter rate or something like that. Drains you'd lay yourself and things like that. Whereas now everything becomes it's more a subcontractor model. So it's more like a construction management style, where a lot of it, you find that the teams on the ground are a lot leaner than what they need to be. And then in saying that, when they're lean, they don't have enough coverage, and you leave a lot of the quality and things like that up to the subcontractor to manage, and they just come back and give you a full
Mm.
package. I think that's where a lot of things are going to at the moment, and that's you can kind of see that, you know, in the market where a lot of these smaller subcontractors from years ago are becoming very large and coming to do their own works at 30, 40 million, where they were doing $100 million contracts previously.
What's the danger with that? So if we go to that and we're sub, what's the danger in that?
I think, and I still, when I talk to a lot of people as well, I think my mantra is, when you get to site, you always go out in the morning, you kind of go out at lunch, you go at the end of the day, so you understand what's being done. Whereas now, I think that's lost. A lot of the people coming through the system now are just almost glued to their computers, doing quality, safety, all this sort of stuff. They don't seem to have the time to go out, or, you know, when you're out on site, we didn't really have camera phones, but you go out and you take a million photos, and they'd all be there as a record. Whereas these days, people aren't out all the time. They'll just walk out a couple of times, or they rely on the drone flying over once or twice a month, take some good photos of them. And when you ask them, "Oh, how'd that happen?" They're like, "Oh, I don't know." It's like, well, who's looking after it? It comes back to you entrusting the contractor to be doing the right thing. I'm not saying that they're not up for it, because they're probably the guys who do it. But again, they haven't been taught the same way, because it's kind of the same way the apprentice and the plumber. Were they taught
Mm.
correctly? Were they not? They've been on, I wouldn't say proper projects, but have you been on a transport or a government project where the standards are higher than what they are for, say, a residential house build
Mm.
or something like that?
So if they haven't had that experience and they haven't worked on the major projects, how have you seen them learn and improve their quality on projects?
That's the next question. But it's yeah, look, I guess it's the older people like myself just sort of go out and say, "Hey, is that
Mentoring.
really what you want? Is that right? Is there something wrong with that?" That's kind of, well, it sort of comes back to it's one of my pet peeves where everybody says, "Hey, it's a subject matter expert," and that subject matter expert is now the contractor. So they're not even an engineer, or somebody. A lot of the older grey-haired people in our industry are retiring, and they're not passing that battalion on. You know what I mean? The baton on. Sorry. So I think that's where it's
Yeah.
kind of coming
So
from.
we need to make sure that we're not just retaining all that knowledge, that we are mentoring and or, especially on site, that they're
Correct.
imparting that to the engineers that are coming through and making the time. Is that a byproduct of the fact that we've had to have, you just mentioned it before, leaner teams? Because some of the people I've spoken to in leadership on site on some of the projects, if the team's so lean, they're struggling to get enough time to do the mentoring piece and the learning piece that they need to as well, and some people are being stuck a little bit in the deep end.
Yeah, agreed. It sort of comes back to tight budgets. People pricing it lean, and then to deliver it. I think the biggest component, and I always say, a project is a project, and it should be relatively built for the same price. You don't win and lose it off your direct costs. It's always the on cost of your preliminaries, your margin, your risk you put on it. I think that's where the
Mm,
problem is. And that's where you find that to win the job, you drop some staff off it, because that's your biggest cost. The longer the job goes, the more they cost you. You can't
yeah,
just turn them off, right? You need
yeah.
them there to finish. And I think that's part of the
And I
issue.
think that that's when we talk about, we look at the average, what is the average margin that a contractor would make on a project at the moment? I don't wanna just assume. What do you think it would sit?
It varies anywhere from 6 to 7 up to,
Yeah.
15 to 20.
6 to 7's pretty low, right? Like, if you're dealing in that 6 to 7%, it doesn't leave much margin for error.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, and it's the amount of risk, or, you make one mistake, it's gone. That's why I always say that, that you make your money before you start the project, before you break ground, because otherwise you're just chasing your tail the whole way through.
So, I guess you've had so much different experience. You've worked having your own business. You're now client side. You've been on project as a contractor. What's the legacy that you want to leave for the work you've been doing, I guess, in the sector and also personally?
It's a good question. I think, from the past, being, I guess, in infrastructure, a lot of your works are buried. Yeah. And I think that's the problem. It's like, you know, I've done water mains, sewer mains. Like, what do you got to show for it? Nothing. You can't say, "Oh, I built that." Where you sort of go to a dam, it's like, "Yeah, I did that one." Or, you go to a bridge, remember that bridge or that road. So you've got a little bit. But I think the difference now is where you're in the development space and you do a lot of subdivisions. Like, yeah, I had a part in that. So I'm out here at South Appin with Walkers, and it's like I had a part of that. Or it's the next vision, Riverlea in South Australia, or even West Appin where the next big development is. So it's like you're actually delivering something that is tangible and people can see. Wow, that was really good. I think that's the difference from going to building a road or a bridge to a master plan
Mm.
community, I think.
Okay, well, the next questions that we go into is the rocket round. It's a few fun questions where we learn a bit more about you. First one, cats or dogs? I just
Dogs,
need to say that. Uh, Coffee or wine?
coffee.
And favorite holiday destination?
Uh, Somewhere different every
Somewhere
year.
different every year. Yeah, you
That's
have.
what we
You
do.
never go, you're always looking at a different place. What's the plan this year?
Correct. The Northern Lights.
Wow. Okay, exciting. And other
Yeah.
podcasts that you listen to?
Um, Probably yours only. I'm not a podcast type of
Yeah,
person,
okay.
unfortunately. I'm more of a music person. That's I guess, my relax. Yeah, like I tell you, I run, put the music in. That's it. Zoning out.
Yeah, awesome.
That's me
And
done.
running's been a massive part of your life and well-being too.
Yeah, probably has for a fair
Mm.
part of it, but yeah, like I've said, I just run with a good bunch of boys, and I guess that's why I keep doing it.
Um,
I always say to them, "It's not the running; it's the coffee after."
nice. That's why you selected coffee. And what makes you
Yeah.
feel like you're home?
Um, I don't know. It's really hard. Feel like I'm home. Just, I guess, being in the backyard or
You're
something
handy in the
like that.
backyard?
Potting, potting around the garage
Yeah,
or something
yeah.
like that. Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for coming on as a guest. I think that you've shared a lot around your
that's right.
journey, and I think some things for people to think about when they're delivering projects, engineers particularly, because that's obviously a large amount of our audience are engineers and obviously the contractors.
Yes.
And I hope that they take something away from this. I'd love for them to also be able to connect with you. Where can they do that? Where's the best platform for them to connect with you?
Through LinkedIn, I guess it'd be the easiest. Like I said, I'm happy to mentor other people like I do now. It just, like I said, it's parting my knowledge to the next generation. And like I said, you'd be nowhere without it. I sort of have a few people that have, I guess, shaped my career where I was. And one of the stories I told you was where I've sort of just out of my own business, working with somebody I know, and they said you need to pick a profession and be good at it. And I'm like, yeah, no, I saw that concrete paver going down the highway for the rest of my life and made a point to, you know, do a lot of different areas of the infrastructure so I could be versatile. And, I think that's what people need to understand as well. It's just having that, you know, question to ask. And I think one of my other rules that I always say to everybody, the answer is 3 phone calls away. You ring 3 people, but it's not those 3 people. They've got another 3 people, and those may have another 3 people. So you create this network where you can get an answer when you don't know. And don't be scared to put your hand up and say, I don't know, because that's the only way
It
you
is
learn.
massive. I'm glad you touched on that. One thing that I love about this industry, and I think it is pretty unique to construction infrastructure, is salt of the earth people, down to earth. And if you don't know, you can ask, and there'll be somebody willing to help you. And then what
Correct.
happens is it's this reciprocal relationship where you know each other for 10, 20 years and you can call on each other and support each other in your strengths. And
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
something I think that people don't realize about the industry until you're in it. And I definitely have seen it because sometimes, obviously, we recruit mainly in construction infrastructure, but we do adjacent industries too. So I get to see the other sectors. And the unique part is that
Yes.
these projects that you work on, you're essentially building your work family. You're building these people that you can rely on, not just on that project, but for decades to come.
Correct. Yeah. And like you say, you always work with a different team. So you'll have a team, they'll move on, you'll create a new team. But like I said, you always stay
Mm.
in contact with them. And that's one thing I do urge, that always stay in contact with the people you've worked for or with, because then, like you say, you've always got that network of people. You might need them tomorrow, but you might be doing a similar project where you say, what'd you do there? And they'll be
Yeah.
able to let you know.
It's massive too because I think that's something as well the engineers coming through are learning as well that all the people I know that have worked, they will remember someone they've worked with 15 years ago on a project. They'll catch up over at a joint venture or a table and be, "Oh, hey," and we go to QMCA events and I see
Yeah.
them hugging and they're like, "We worked at, 3 projects ago together," and they're so excited to see each other. And I think it can be, you're right, it can be so easy to lose touch or lose contact with those people, and calling up and asking questions is an easy way to keep in touch with each other. You've always been really
Definitely.
good at that. I will say that. Like we've kept in touch for so long now, and you will always let me know when you're coming from Sydney, and I will do the same when I visit. So I think it's just
Yeah.
being conscious of just keeping tabs and keeping in touch with people and not letting those relationships lapse because you just never know when you're going to need to support each other.
correct. Like I said before, you get a better understand what's going on in the
Mm.
industry as well, because you might be on a project, they'll be on another project, that might be remote, they might be in Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, or something like that, and you sort of talk to them and you get a bit of an understanding of what else
It
is out
also
there.
helps you, as you spoke before, have that think ahead. You know how you said you were always able to know what was coming or be aware of everything, and I think that's your ability to draw on that network and know what's around the corner.
Correct.
So thank you so much for coming on as a guest. So much fun.
No worries. My
And I always
pleasure.
learn something new. I
Thank
didn't
you.
know you wanted to be a vet at one point, so I always learn something new. Look, as always, if you gain something from the episode with Michael, please do reach out to him, connect with him, and share with him what you've learned. I know that past guests have had that happen and they absolutely love it. Like, share, subscribe, rate, review as well. And if you know someone out there needs to hear this episode, please share it with them. You never know what piece of advice or knowledge can just change the trajectory of someone's day. Thanks for listening. If this episode gave you new insights, don't let them go to waste. Take action, apply them. And if you want more insider strategies from the best in construction and infrastructure, make sure to subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the leaders who open the most doors aren't waiting for opportunities, they're building them.